Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a new edition of Quods Get Gold. For those of you who are new to this exercise, I'm Sol Montez Bradley, and this program started as a means of bringing the world to Quod Verum users a long time ago, and we opened it since to the general public. The world, 1 hour at a time. If you like what you see, please click on subscribe and notifications. And right under the video in the description, you will find a link to donate to the Gold Institute for International Strategy. It is a 501c3 corporation. Therefore, your donations will be tax deductible to the extent permitted by law, and it will allow us to continue our work in the Institute and continue to bring to you the world. Tonight, I have a good friend and the vice president for strategy at the Gold Institute, Adam Lovinger, who's just published a book that I have to say, while I followed his efforts to write it for a number of years now, it is amazing. Even though I knew much of what was coming into this, I cannot drop it. And it tells the story of the deep state from a unique perspective. So without further ado, and let Adam introduce himself, I'll bring you Adam Lovinger.
Thank you, Saul. It's a real pleasure to join you, both as a fellow member of the Gold Institute for International Strategy and a longtime friend. I wrote this book, and this is what it looks like. It was published in November by Encounter Books, and I wrote this because what I experienced when I joined the Trump administration is something I did not think could happen in America. My background is I'm a lawyer by training. I was brought up even before going to law school to believe that in America, the facts and law matter, particularly when it comes to federal processes to the government. And the last thing I thought, frankly, before joining the Trump administration as senior director for strategic assessments at the U.S. National Security Council, the last thing I thought was that multiple waves of senior bureaucrats could collaborate with one another to undermine federal processes, make allegations that are completely fraudulent, weaponize the federal investigative process, launch investigations with no legal predicate or even allegations formed, but more just to fish for dirt and to try to destroy their ideological and political and bureaucratic adversaries. I did not think that was possible. But sure enough, as soon as General Michael Flynn was tapped by President Trump to be his first national security advisor, I joined the White House, the NSC, and before I knew it, there were 5 investigations launched against me. I had been in the Pentagon as a civil servant for a dozen years by then, and had a completely spotless record, no security violations. But all of a sudden, 2 administrative investigations, 3 criminal investigations launched against me, and sort of sent me off into this sort of netherland in which to fight these fabricated charges. So I wrote this book because this state of affairs, this corruption, should not exist in the United States. But not only does it exist, it systemically exists. There are a group of hyper-empowered government officials occupying key nodes within the national security bureaucracy and the intelligence community and the law enforcement bureaucracy. Not every job, so I think it's important not to paint with too broad of brushstrokes that the deep state is all of the administrative state. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that there are certain key nodes that are controlled by genuine criminal co-conspirators. And I don't use that term lightly. They're knowingly and willfully subverting U.S. law.
Yeah, that brings me to something that we've discussed several times as to the nature of the deep state. There are all kinds of fantasies flying about online, with some people imagining some sort of cabal in a basement with a Moriarty coordinating every evil in the world from some kind of colonial building in Georgetown. That is not the case. We can say that the origins of the deep state began with the idea that technocrats were better to govern than politicians. And some positions in government that used to change hands whenever political parties succeeded each other became permanent. And for many people, that permanence became an objective in its own. There are people throughout the bureaucratic state whose only interest is to remain in position, collecting a salary until retirement or death, whatever comes first. But that state of affairs also makes it easier for bad actors to embed themselves into that bureaucracy. And those are the people you're referring to, aren't you?
Yeah, the people that I'm referring to, so just to back up a bit, the origins of the administrative state. I mean, I understand the argument that the United States is a major superpower. It has many complex, specialized functions that require expertise, and that our elected officials, can't do everything, and that there is a need for a federal bureaucracy. I think that working properly, and there are examples throughout history when bureaucracies have worked very well. For example, the British Colonial Office, the British Foreign Ministry, during the 19th century. I mean, there were some very rigorous exams that had to be passed, and there were standards that were quite impressive of lawfulness. What I encountered, and the problem I have, is the lawlessness of certain hyper-empowered senior government bureaucrats. Once you get that lawlessness where federal processes can be weaponized to be turned against your fellow Americans, where the FBI can collaborate with the Barack Obama administration and the Hillary Clinton campaign to generate genuine lies about what candidate Trump and then President Trump was up to regarding Russia. This is when you get a real insider threat, which is the name of my book. And it's not just because America is not working properly and there's corruption. It's also because that corruption acts as a magnet for foreign intervention in the U.S. government. The Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians. One of their great lessons is that it's very difficult to take America head on, to go toe to toe. But if you can insinuate yourself, and these are authoritarian regimes that are very adept and very good at dirty tricks and in infiltration. If you can insinuate yourself into the very open United States of America and our very open government, there's tremendous amounts of mischief that can be done. And so it's the misconduct of the U.S. government officials that creates that very attractive rot that serves as the attraction for our enemies.
Kind of like an active measures paradise they can multiply the effect of their action by placing one of their operatives in one of these circles.
That's absolutely correct. And one of the things that I've observed, Saul, is if you step back and you look at the protests that have erupted on American college campuses post October 7th,
Yep.
there's not only a pro-Hamas flavor to those protests, there's also a very anti-American flavor. Just for an
Yes.
example, I teach at Georgetown University. I'm a graduate of Georgetown University. My son goes to Georgetown University.
We're not going to hold that against you.
Okay, I live very close to this campus. The other day there was some spray paint, on the front of one of the buildings that had the upside down, triangle, which is the sort of the pro-Hamas triangle, and it said "Free Palestine" on one side, and on the other side of the doorway that was spray painted, it said U.S. Army equals imperialism. And so you have this worldview that's on display at America's most elite university campuses. It's a fashionable worldview on the political left, for the coastal elites, for the ruling class, whatever you want to call it. These kids do grow up. They join the federal government. They join the national security bureaucracy. This anti-American worldview comes into the national security bureaucracy. I'll give you an example. During the Obama administration, at the end of the Obama administration, the longtime head of the highest level strategy office in the Pentagon, a gentleman by the name of Andrew Marshall, was unceremoniously removed, and a genuine deep state operative was implanted to lead that office.
Marshall was there from the inception of the ONA, wasn't he?
Yes, he was the first director of net assessment. He was brought over from the Rand Corporation by Henry Kissinger in 1971 to the National Security Council. 2 years later, Jim Schlesinger brought Andy Marshall from the NSC to the Pentagon to become the first director of the Office of Net Assessment, which is the highest level strategy office in the Pentagon. I worked there for a dozen years. Andy Marshall was my mentor. So he was the director of ONA from 1973 until 2015, the final year of the Obama administration. So Marshall, a longtime legendary strategic thinker, and in many respects an author of some of the great net assessments that helped inform U.S. national security strategy to defeat the Soviet Union in the Cold War, he was removed and an operative of the deep state was put in place. What do I mean by that? In my book, I lay out the worldview of James H. Baker, who's the director of the Office of Net Assessment. He adopts America's enemies and policies. He adopts America's enemies' policies for America's own. He is quoted as saying, "Losing Taiwan to China is not an insult to U.S. national interests." He is quoted as saying, and these are all official documents, primacy is increasingly costly, such as the defense of Israel and Taiwan. So if you look at these statements, adopting America's enemies' policies for America's own, this is what he's doing in saying this. But that's just the beginning. That's just the beginning.
That's the philosophy that inspired Obama's apology tour, and a policy of taking down the U.S. a few notches to allow for the resurgence of regional powers, competing powers, so as to keep American imperialism in check. And that was the policy of the Obama administration for 8 years.
That's absolutely correct. One of the things I lay out in my book is how Obama genuinely comes from a worldview that adopts diversity, equity, and inclusion, critical race theory, political correctness. This is sort of a guiding light for Obama's domestic policy view. He did not have much experience in foreign policy. So what he did is he adopted this view of equity to inform
Right.
America's grand strategy. And if you look at equity, it was like, well,
There is no American exceptionalism. There is moral parity in this world.
correct. And not only that, it's regarding the balance of power. He did not prize, as any ordinary American president would prize, American preeminence. He saw American power, primacy in the world, as not equitable. And he set out to really, cut America down to size. He tried to make the case for this publicly. He, went around the world on what many have called his apology tour in his first term of office, apologized for America's, global role, which of course is not always a peaceful role, but in order to uphold a US-led global order, sometimes force must be needed. And that's something that any American president has recognized from the very beginnings of our republic. But what he did once the American people reacted negatively towards this American diminishment, what he did, and this brings us back to the deep state, is he turned inward. He's like, well, if the American people do not support this worldview of cutting America down to size, and compared to our non-Western countries, he will transform the U.S. national security bureaucracy from within. And this is what I observed over 12 years, 8 years under Obama, but what I observed in the Pentagon.
Right. And in that context is when he puts Baker in ONA.
Exactly correct. And I mentioned earlier about Baker advocating for America's enemies' positions. He was also a famous minimizer of threats posed to America. In the year 2017, after China had established its first military base in Djibouti in East Africa, Baker, goes and says that China's, role in the world is entirely regional. And that same year, he wrote that Iran may safely possess a nuclear weapon. So this is a worldview that it's about equity. And in this regard, regarding Iran, it's about, Israel, which is a close U.S. ally, has nuclear weapons. He wants to balance Israel with Iran's nuclear weapons.
Right.
Yeah.
You know that I as I hear you now, I can't but chuckle inside. China as a regional power, that's why they have a naval base in Djibouti controlling access to Bab el Mandeb,
Right.
which has proven to be as vital as we thought it was when we first spoke about it 6 years ago.
Yeah.
Satellite arrays in Argentina, ports in Peru. Apparently, that is all part of the Chinese region that extends from Mexico to Madagascar.
Yeah, it's and this classic sort of soft peddling of threats to America. This is it's not only the sort of the DEI and critical race theory worldview implanted into the national security bureaucracy. It is also genuinely the talking points of America's enemies. America's enemies have really feed the deep state talking points. And this is something that the evidence is at this point overwhelming of this collaboration. I lay out a lot of it in my book of the Office of Net Assessment collaborating not only with the former head of Russian foreign intelligence and Stefan Halper to generate the sourcing material for the Steele dossier, which then became the basis for the Hillary Clinton smear campaign of Trump, otherwise known as the Russia collusion hoax, but also, sharing adversary classified intelligence with the suspected Chinese spy. Real genuine subversion, heavily documented. And, this is the insider threat that I name in the book.
Let me put it there so people can see the cover. That is the insider. By the way, you just mentioned Stephen Halper. He's one of my favorites. People don't know this because the media hasn't picked up on good old Stevie yet. He was the alma mater behind the Cambridge. It was an institute.
Yeah, the Cambridge
Ah,
Security Initiative. Yeah.
the Cambridge Security Initiative that was closed down amidst allegations that it was operating as a spy ring for the Russians, together with Dearlove. He had a great participation in a certain school in London, in Rome, and a society, and a think tank in London, uh, that where FBI and CIA and Pentagon officials were sent to learn about the world as it is in very peculiar terms. He's also a Rhodes Scholar, unlike Bill Clinton, who never finished his studies. So, however much they say he's a Rhodes Scholar, he isn't. A requirement was to graduate. But this guy, who was in the same dorm, did. And from the time that he shared quarters with Clinton in Oxford, he has been a tool of the Clinton political machine. And all of a sudden, he is, leading uh, operations that are eventually deemed to be Russian intelligence operations by the English government, and by anybody with a half a brain. And in that position is when the Office of Net Assessment starts buying information from him.
Yeah. What I lay out in the book, there's a certain conventional view of the Russia hoax that centers on the FBI. And definitely there's a very large FBI component to the Russia collusion hoax. In my book, I show a different aspect of the Russia, collusion hoax, which was it's the institutional infrastructure that was built to permit that hoax to take off. That was built within the U.S. Department of Defense Office of Net Assessment, where I served. So I saw these contracts, these DoD contracts between the U.S. Department of Defense and Stephen Halper, beginning in the year 2010, and there were a series of 6 contracts from 2010 to 2016 on which Stephen Halper was including the former head of Russian foreign intelligence. Now, everyone in the business knows that there is no former Russian intelligence officer. They must serve Moscow until their last dying breath. So here were these curious contracts that permitted Russian intelligence to insert disinformation into U.S. Department of Defense products. And, Stephen Halper was the one that was facilitating this. Why is this so important from the Russia collusion hoax context? It's extremely important because Hillary Clinton was relying, her campaign and the Democratic National Committee funded this thing called the Steele dossier. The Steele dossier ultimately is sourced to Stephen Halper and to Russian intelligence. This is, you look at the US Department of Justice Inspector General report, this sourcing comes from Stephen Halper. Those reports make very clear. That's a rather risky thing for somebody as risk averse as Hillary Clinton, who's a careful, lawyerly type. The reason why it was so important for her to have this Office of Net Assessment contract vehicle with Stephen Halper and the former head of Russian intelligence is that if DOD is relying upon this information, this disinformation from Moscow, and having it inserted into Pentagon reports, well, that normalizes Hillary Clinton's reliance on the same sourcing.
Right.
And so the corrupt deep state inside the US Department of Defense was genuinely collaborating with Moscow to create this plausible deniability for their favored, political candidate, Hillary Clinton, as she comes down the pike. And, in 2010, it was known that, Hillary had lost out to Obama for that presidency, but she was U.S. Secretary of State, had friends in the Pentagon, including Deputy Secretary of Defense Bob Work, who was really doing this as a gift to Hillary Clinton.
As a service to a friend. She
That's
also
right.
had a lot of friends in Moscow.
Please enlighten
Something
me.
that gets
Doesn't surprise me.
something that gets lost in this particular caper, and we're gonna do another show with it. But from Lavrov to the Ripaska, there were a lot of people who wanted to help her.
Ah, yes, of course, absolutely. Yeah.
It is the irony of the Russia canard that the people doing the accusation were the ones who had the dirty laundry.
Yeah, and the way I describe that, there are a lot of Americans. It's no surprise that there's a lot of confusion about, if you were to ask an ordinary American, who was collaborating with Russia, I would say a lot of them who, are looking at sort of the surface level will say, well, it was Donald Trump. That's exactly what Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama wants Americans to believe. And
Yes.
the way they can do this is through, a very tried and true information warfare tactic called deflection and deflection. So you accuse your adversary of what you yourself are doing. And it just does wonders to human psychology. And it's, unsurprisingly, it's a Soviet information warfare tactic.
Oh, yes. Although I would say it was first developed by Ed Bernays, a chap who was instrumental in developing propaganda techniques for the Woodrow Wilson administration, and a chap that Goebbels cites as his inspiration, to put it mildly. So it's an old story. The Russians used it, yes, but long before the Russians used it was in use in the halls of Washington by the very same people that are doing it today.
Yeah.
It's a rather interesting phenomenon. So, but Hillary had more friends inside the Pentagon than you mentioned, and people essentially feeding narratives through the Office of Net Assessment into the administration.
Yes, I would say that a lot of the information that was provided to senior leadership during the Obama administration, from various actors within the Office of Net Assessment was, really about, frankly, undermining U.S. interests, undermining U.S. allies. The flip side of the coin of undermining U.S. interests and actively undermining U.S. interests and U.S. allies is simply just by not even doing your job. One of the
Right.
things in the course of my research I discovered is that the Office of Net Assessment only has one statutory duty. So under federal statute, the Office of Net Assessment is required to produce one net assessment at a minimum a year. And what is a net assessment? A net assessment is really a strategic assessment of how the United States stands up vis-a-vis America's competitors. And so the term net is about the power relationship, because gross power is irrelevant in a vacuum. Power is only relevant in a strategic context when you're competing against another adversary. And so, net assessment looks at the net power of America vis-a-vis our adversaries.
The pros and cons of America versus the pros and cons of its adversaries, and where the balance stands.
Correct. And by not producing net assessments, you can't produce responsible national security strategy, because without the assessment of, what does the competition even look like, any strategy is then sort of built on sort of a house of cards, or at least an unsubstantial foundation. And so during the entirety of the Obama administration, there were no net assessments completed by the Office of Net Assessment, because what's the purpose of national security strategy? It's to ensure American preeminence and uphold the
which
U.S.-led
no
global
longer
order.
interested in.
Right.
Yeah. Holy cannoli! You know, the more I listen to you, I don't know if I get more depressed or more incensed, or probably a combination of both. Because what was happening at at the Office of Net Assessment was also happening at the State Department. It was definitely happening on steroids in the Department of Homeland Security. So it is the entirety of the national security and intelligence communities. I never liked that phrase, by the way, but it is descriptive, that were affected by this uh, defeatism on purpose.
Yeah, no, I think that's entirely accurate. You look at, for example, the entirety of the of the Biden administration. You have Secretary of State Blinken making these repeated trips to the Middle East to accomplish really nothing. There's this sort of extraordinary lack of interest within the national security bureaucracy, the foreign policy community, to actually win America's wars. We spent 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan without winning. There were no net assessments to inform those long wars. You really have to ask yourself, what is going on here? And just this last summer, there were 3 U.S. House of Representatives committees that collaborated in an investigation into the Biden family. And they concluded that the Biden family had taken tens of millions of dollars from the Communist Party of China, from
Yep.
PRC related interests. You look at the Hillary Clinton Foundation, many, many millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars from America's enemies.
Yes.
The Russians were great funders of both Bill and Hillary Clinton, as with the Chinese. You look at these elites and the collaboration between these elites and America's foremost enemies. No wonder we're losing so much. No wonder we can't win our wars. No wonder there's a deliberate subversion of the capacity of America to craft net assessments to inform national security strategies. So we enter wars, we send our young Americans, the best and brightest, off to fight these wars at the prime of their life, and they're turned into.
And we betray them.
Yeah, we betray them.
And we betray them. Let's use the word, because these were and are eminently winnable wars in fairly short order. It is almost by design that they languished. What Obama did in 2011 in Iraq is set it back 7 years. By the time he was done, set it back 20. And this is done, I would venture, on purpose. In the meantime, I don't know, the brother of Joe Biden was making mint with contracts in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm awaiting a pardon for him any day now. And these people make money in association with America's enemies, undermining America's efforts to bring a little bit of order to this world, which is, I would propose, vital to protect America's interests and its economy.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Saul. If you look at a lot of think tanks around Washington, D.C., you look at various foundations, you look at a lot of American universities, they get foreign money. And one of the curious things is they don't get much money from our allies. They get money from our enemies. For example, my own alma mater, Georgetown University, it has a campus in the country of Qatar. Qatar, of course, is one of the greatest sponsors of Hamas. Hamas is a U.S. terrorist organization. And so it makes perfect sense. If you're an enemy of the United States of America, you want to insinuate yourself into American institutions to bring this country down. There is no greater.
And to whitewash their image in the process,
Exactly.
so
And
that
there's
those very students you're referring to look to Qatar as an example of development, and they don't realize what it is they're looking at.
exactly. And you get this insinuation, and of course, there's no greater prize for our enemies than inserting themselves into our national security bureaucracy, into our military, into our highest level strategy office within the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where this subversion takes place, as I lay out in my book. And it's really a horrendous state of affairs. I talk in the last chapter of my book about one of my students at Georgetown, and Georgetown has a special relationship with the Pentagon, and that some of its most promising officers, rising up through the ranks, they get a master's degree at Georgetown, and that sort of is a springboard to an even higher level command. They
Right.
become my students. I had one West Point graduate, a U.S. Army captain, in my class. And after seeing the way the deep state went after General Flynn and went after myself, he comes up to me, he says, "Professor Levenger, based upon what happened to you, I no longer have any confidence in the Pentagon to have my back when I'm deployed in war zones overseas. I'm going to do my time and get out." So you mentioned the term betrayal. This is a genuine betrayal.
Yeah.
We are betraying our best and brightest, this
Yes.
deep state. And so, one of the things that we see a lot in the press these days is the corporate mainstream media attacking Donald Trump's plans for dismantling the deep state. And of course, at first, the mainstream media was denying the existence of this
Yes.
criminal conspiracy.
It's a conspiracy theory.
Yes, exactly. David Ignatius of the Washington Post called it Trump's crazy talk. That's
Yeah.
the deep state.
Now, David Ignatius, we'll talk about it one of these days, is a perfect example of a plant of foreign enemies into our media.
There's a lot of evidence in that direction. There's a lot of evidence. David Ignatius, he leaked this this phone call that Mike Flynn took
Yes,
from
with
the Russian
Kislyak.
ambassador. It was a classified document that was leaked. David Ignatius reported upon it. And this was, of course, used to destroy General Flynn's reputation.
And he was instrumental in publishing the dossier, so that the dossier could be backed up by the dossier itself in a request for a FISC order to investigate General Flynn. And David Ignatius was instrumental in the caper to use a document as a proof of the existence of the document, or the veracity of the document, in a most sophomoric way, I should say, but it worked.
Yeah. What Ignatius was doing is again, it's a tried and true technique of creating an echo chamber. You generate lies, you leak the lies, they get reported in the press, and then once
you use the press reports to legitimize the lie.
Exactly, they can be echoed elsewhere, and the more these lies get echoed, the more they become legitimate in the eyes of official Washington and many people. So you're absolutely right. There is a genuine collaboration between the deep state and the media. In my case, lies about me were leaked to the press, and they're quite hateful lies. And I had a rather distinguished neighbor who contacted the reporter and said, "Listen, you're reporting this nasty stuff about Adam Lovinger. I don't think it's correct. I think it's a lie. And this reporter, tells my neighbor and colleague, he's like, I can't afford to print the truth because I depend, as a reporter on the national security bureaucracy, I depend upon these leaks. So if the deep state wants me to report something, I can't say no.
Yeah.
And this is, Trump talks about fake news. Of course, he's ridiculed for fake news, but reporters themselves admit that they are reliant. They have to, in order to feed themselves and maintain themselves in their job, they must really be at the beck and call of these lies that are used to smear enemies of the deep state. Of course, it keeps them in business for the time being, but it fundamentally undermines the profession of journalism. And,
Yep.
So much so that the Columbia University Journalism School had to do an entire study on the collaboration between the New York Times and the Washington Post and other august news organizations, how they propagated the Hillary Clinton generated Trump-Russia collusion hoax and, made it, essentially propagandized their readership into believing that this was something true. And, Columbia Journalism School, of course, considers itself as, upholding the standards of journalism integrity. It bestows upon journalists the Pulitzer Prize. Sure enough, it gave the Pulitzer Prize to people who wrote about this Trump-Russia collusion that didn't exist. And they reported
Yes.
it as fact.
It should be called the Durante Prize.
Yeah.
Because they've been doing this for decades.
Yes.
You publish Stalin's propaganda as your own articles, you get a Pulitzer and recognition for life. And when finally it is discovered, nobody cares.
Yeah.
But a lot of people died because of that. And
Absolutely.
they're doing the same thing now. What they did to you, we just blew through 3/4 of an hour. So in the last 15 minutes, what they did to you, the reason you are here discussing your book, is one of the most obscene cases of corruption that I have witnessed, and I have lived in countries that are notoriously corrupt. The way that you were set up, I don't know if you want to talk about that or not. The way that you were set up so that they could sideline you and eliminate you as a threat. It is something that I never thought possible I would see in America.
Yeah. No, I got to tell you, Saul, it's something I didn't think was possible either. One of the things I have to say, I do, it is somewhat eye-watering, the extent that they went to go after little old me. I mean, I'm not an important person. I'm not a national figure. I was a civil servant, not even a political appointee, but I just so happened to have been tapped by President Trump's national security advisor in this first term to come in and make sure we had strategies to win our wars. I mean, that's why I was appointed senior director for strategic assessments, because there was a recognition that we were strategically blind in Iraq and Afghanistan and China, and that there was this genuine subversion of America's capacity to preserve our preeminence, to preserve American primacy, to uphold this U.S.-led global order that Trump had inherited from the Obama administration. And so because I believe that the reason why I was targeted with the ferocity that I was, and I lay out in the book, is not so much because of me, but it's because of what General Flynn asked me to do. It's like, let's ensure America has strategies to win our wars. That was my job number one. Number two, let's clean up this deep state that fundamentally undermines this capacity. And this was just it was like a nuclear bomb went off. And I mean, the investigations launched against me. I had a naval criminal investigative service, counterintelligence, counterterrorism investigation launched against me. Why? Because I had gone to Costa Rica with my family to on holiday, where my wife is from. I mean, the most like crazy pretexts. But the whole point of this is that
No, well, we,
there's
we we all know the influence of the Costa Rican mafia. Uh,
right, right. And one of the crazy things about that investigation was that they had launched the investigation first and then only learned about my going to Costa Rica later. So
right.
I mean, it's like this retroactive
Yes, we,
legitimization of
we
what they're
we
doing.
we can adjust along the way.
Exactly. It's
Eh,
just like, and the thing is, it's so flagrant, which is something that it should be worrying to Americans. And that, I mean, they don't even try to weaponize the federal investigative process in a sophisticated way. They just do it lazily and easily. No checks and balances. So
No,
I know we're running out of time. I'd like to kind of end on a positive note, if you don't mind. And that is that
absolutely.
and that I do think that there is now a recognition amongst ordinary Americans, and polling shows this, that there is a criminal conspiracy within the U.S. national security bureaucracy that works against America's interests. That is known. I'm hoping that my book will show that there is a more sinister element of that, which is that the deep state is genuinely a tool of the Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians to undermine America from within. That's also important because typically, when you have, the clear hand and fingerprints of America's enemies on this deep state, this should crystallize our appreciation for this. The other thing that is encouraging, Saul, is that I talk about finding what I call the deep state playbook on my computer in the Pentagon, I mean, in the Department of Defense. And the tactics, the techniques, the procedures, the way the deep state weaponizes the federal investigative process to target their adversaries is a very rote thing. And they do the same thing over and over again to all of their adversaries. I'm by training a national security strategist. What I can tell you is that when your enemy does the same thing over and over again and is actually relatively constrained within operating within a bureaucratic framework like the deep state is, that is a perfect opening for a counter strategy to bring in
Right.
accountability, because there's not the infinite room for maneuver that an adversary would want. They're kind of boxed in. And all we need to do to rein in the deep state is to inject government accountability. When laws are broken, when crimes are committed, at the very least, those who are committing these crimes should have their security clearances suspended immediately as a precautionary measure, not necessarily as an allegation of guilt, but this is
No.
a national security threat. Suspend the clearance, investigate them. Nobody does this, Saul. These deep state operatives are they're never touched, and that is that impunity encourages this lawlessness and this rot, and continues to be a powerful beacon to America's adversaries. It's essentially advertising, come in and do what you
Yeah.
want to do, because America is defenseless, because it has this internal rot that can be exploited.
Yes, you mentioned China and Russia, but lately we've had quite a few reports of Iran infiltrating the Department of Defense and Homeland Security. And Iran is not this big power. It's a rather pitiful non-power, and yet they're able to position their agents, their spies, their operators at high levels in the White House, in the Department of State, in Homeland Security, in the Department of Defense. it's like we have not even a revolving door, an open door.
Yeah. One of the very clever things about what's happening to us from our adversaries' perspective is that Americans culturally, we're not very, we've never been good, for example, at espionage or foreign special operations tactics. I think that Americans are rather sort of culturally rather credulous, and we're just not a conniving people. I mean, there's something about, I think, our heritage that,
Too many moral qualms.
yeah, yeah, there's some moral qualms, but there's also something just about, I believe it's our Judeo-Christian values and maybe sort of the, you know, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant old-fashioned values that in many respects, you know, created America. Nevertheless, the Russians particularly, but also perhaps the Chinese, I mean the Iranians even more so. These are cultures where subversion, compromat, you know, the intrigues of the bizarre are inculcated in those cultures sort of through mother's milk. They're very good at it. And so when you look at the long-term strategic competition between America, an open, rather credulous society that, you know, can't, our spy services could never really co-opt others very well. We're just bad at it. Versus these other cultures that are so conniving culturally. It's just the way they are. It's like, you know, putting
Are
one.
you suggesting? Are you suggesting that we would be better if we had souks in our cities?
I'm not suggesting anything. What I am saying is that
No,
you
no. What I'm
looking at
saying
it.
is that ability to hide and negotiate and not expose one's feelings
Yeah.
that
What
you
I am
referred to.
suggesting is that our adversaries has very cleverly put up their comparative advantage up against America's
Yeah.
comparative weakness and locked us into this long-term competition where this gets continuously reinforced. And so this is the strategic insider threat of the deep state. It gets hooked up with America's enemies and it does tremendous damage. So
And to end up in that optimistic tone, do you see us having any success in the, if not immediate, in our midterm future in dismantling this?
I do. And I'll tell you, I think one of the greatest indicators that we should have some hope is that President Trump himself is not a Washington insider. There's a lot of American politicians that must do, they sort of work their way up the ranks of the American political process. And in order to do that, they almost always must strike deals with the deep state. Trump was and remains an outsider. He has never had to make those dirty deals in order to get to the next rung of politics. He's always come in right at the very top. That's number one. Number two is you look at his picks for cabinet officials and others. He's choosing some rather unconventional, un-Washington type choices for some of these key agencies. He that to me shows that he's got more confidence this time around as president as he did the first time. The first time he won, and he put in people like Rex Tillerson and Jim Mattis in these high-level positions, and these were real insiders, and they were not representative of the drain the swamp ethos and promise that Trump had run on. This time around, I think he is choosing some, you know, more aggressive choices. Kash Patel as the head of the FBI is a fabulous choice. He understands the pathologies of that organization, and he has very good ideas on how to dismantle that corruption. But also, you know, as a third point, I mean, Trump is now speaking with, you know, a lot of articulation on the need to dismantle the deep state. And actually, he even put out a 10-point plan on dismantling the deep state and transferring power back to the American people. And there's some very intelligent points in that. And so the will is there, the personnel is there, the policies are there. Now, of course, comes the execution. But everything up until this point suggests that we are on the path to recovery, and but also this means going to war with the deep state. So we'll see, if they fold or if they fight. That remains to be seen.
I don't think they're going to go down without a fight, but I trust that they can be defeated. Now, two more things just on the way out. Where do people buy your book?
Well, thank you for raising that, Saul. So it's available on Amazon, and I'm happy to say that since it was published on November 19th, so it's about a month ago, it has been ranked as the top new release in 3 categories. One is public policy and administration, the other is administrative law, and the third and most recent one is military policy. So the book touches all those subjects. I didn't even know what it means to be a top new release. That doesn't mean it's a bestseller. It means that the velocity of sales is high.
Yes. It means it's selling.
Yeah, it means it's selling quickly. So, I mean, that's great.
So number one, people can go to Amazon, or I assume any other website that sells books.
Correct.
And I'm about to make you a proposition, but one that you can tell your wife about. How about anybody who donates $250 to the Institute gets a signed copy?
That's more than fair, and very, very happy to do that.
So let me do that, and you will have to do nothing but sign them. So for everybody watching, there is a link to a dollar box for the Institute. Donations to the Institute are deductible as much as the law will permit as a 501c3. And if you make a donation and in notes add Lovinger of $250 or more, we'll make sure that you get a signed copy from Adam. And with that said, I hope I can get you again. There are so many subjects that I just thought of. You are a wealth of information, sir.
Thank you, Saul. It's always a great pleasure, and thank you for doing what you do. It's your platform is a great source of education, and there's a lot of secret goings on that are not covered by more mainstream media, and so to make sure that people are informed about what's truly going on, I'm glad that they can come to you.
Yes, without going into the wilderness like so many do. Right. But thank you so much, and I know that you have to leave, so good evening, Adam, and thank you for participating today.
My pleasure.
And now that we have come to the end, I hope you have enjoyed the conversation with Adam Lovinger, and that some of you at least will contribute to the Institute, that it might continue to do its great job of finding real answers to America's quandaries. And that's it for tonight. Again, thank you so very much. And I'll see you at the next edition of Quods Get Gold.